What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Squiddy. Okay, so I made a bunch of Tearlaments videos, and today I want to make some videos about anti-Tearlament cards. If you're not playing Tearlament decks, how do you beat this deck? Obviously, there are a lot of immediate side deck cards that come to mind, or tech cards. I don't know, Dimensional Shifter, maybe Evenly Matched, cards like Artifact Scythe, Barrier, Ghost Reaper, cards that people are already playing, but I want to show you guys some cards that are not really common. At the top, number 10, we have Mystic Mine. Okay, this card, everyone already knows that this card has been a plague in the last couple of formats, and it's still at 3. Surprise, surprise, this card is actually really, really good into Tearlaments, especially when they build a board. So if they have like a Abyss Dweller, Elf, maybe a Rukalos, or like a Dragostapelia, this essentially just shuts off their entire board. And it also shuts off the card effects in their graveyard. And not a lot of players are playing outs to this. Obviously, they can out it if they do happen to have Tearlament's crime set, which is a Solemn Judgment that allows them to shuffle back the card by negating. But again, even if they have that, it forces out the negation, like the Omni Negate, which is super, super good off one card without you having to invest anything except for a card from your hand. You didn't normal summon, you didn't waste any effects. You didn't even reveal what deck you're playing potentially if you happen to main deck this. If they don't have crime, which is a lot of times in game 1, they don't really have access to it or they don't main it, they might just have a Suliak. This turns off their entire board, and it turns off all the Ishizu effects in their graveyard and any card effects in their hand, like having this, so you're able to make your plays. And because they typically have like 3 or more monsters on the board, you can actually you're able to make like a lot of your plays, just like extending 2 monsters, linking them off into 1, and just like cracking their board eventually. And then the only be concerned about, but again, this is like a pseudo negate in that it kind of shuts off the graveyard and the field, so definitely something that you can consider playing in your deck. Number 9 is Soul Drain. This is a floodgate that's seen play in the past couple of, I guess, formats in the past like 10 years or so. You can pay 1,000 life points. It shuts off the Ishizus and the Tearlaments in the graveyard. So super, super nice in that it's basically an Abyss Dweller for all monsters, as well as monsters that are banished. Not that there are any effects in Tearlaments that happen to be banished, but just a cool thing to note, against other decks as well, like Thunder Dragons, it does shut off their effects. You do have to proactively flip this because it does prevent the activation. So if something's activating, it doesn't negate it. But the other thing is that it can actually be outed by the Tearlaments deck if they have an Ishizu monster that they normal summon onto the table and then happen to have Pearl Rhino on the field. They can actually banish the Ishizu monster from the field as well to target 3 cards in the graveyard to shuffle them back. And if they do happen to shuffle back one of their own tier names, they can trigger Pearl Rhino, which allows them to pop the Soul Drain. So just something to be keep your head up about. Number 8, we have Necrovalley. This is another card that's similar to Mystic Mine and that can be used going first or second, and it completely shuts off your opponent's graveyard. It has been errated quite a couple of times, so you definitely want to make sure you get a newer copy of the card, which I believe is in Dusa and Pack's newest from Dusa. The effect is all Gravekeeper's monsters gain 500 attack and events, kind of irrelevant. And then the important part is cards in the graveyard cannot be banished. Negate any card effect that would move a card in the graveyard to a different place. Negate any card effect that changes types or attributes in the graveyard. So this does actually shut off all the tier names as well as the Ishizu names in the graveyard, preventing them from doing anything to that manner. But again, they can out it. Same with Soul Drain, just normal summoning an Ishizu monster and then banishing it while they have Pearl Rhino on the field. That would allow them to trigger the Pearl Rhino and pop the Necrovalley. But the nice thing about this being better somewhat than Soul Drain is that you can activate it going second, so it turns off their entire, during your turn, it turns off their turn, turns off their plays. They can't do like Haviness, they can't banish their Ishizus, and allows you to sort of crack their board if your deck is not graveyard based. Compared to Soul Drain obviously being a trap is nice because you can chain it to their effects to give them a neg 1 potentially on something like a Sharon effect from hand. And also you can use monsters like Sprite Elf. If you're having to play Sprite, you can still revive things, whereas with Necrovalley on the table, you cannot revive anything from the graveyard. Number 7, we have Silent Graveyard. This is an older card that's a spell card, quick effect that allows you to discard a card from your hand, and then it turns off the graveyard for the rest of the turn, essentially, for both players. So any effects that activate the graveyard this turn are negated. Cool little card being quick play, so you can chain it during your turn as a surprise effect. Obviously, the drawback is that you have to discard a card, which is not ideal for a lot of the decks, especially right now, where you have to use like the maximum of every card in your hand to that effect. So discarding a card can sometimes hurt. But if you are playing a deck that wants cards in the graveyard, this can potentially be an extender that enables you to do that. So cool thing to take a look at. Number 6, we have the Transmigration Prophecy, and I guess Crevice into the different dimension to an extent, because they're similar cards. But obviously, Transmigration Prophecy is a lot better, given that you don't have to restrict yourself to attributes, and you can target an Ishizu monster as well as the Tearlaments monster. It's basically an Ishizu monster on a trap. This card has been around for a long time, and it was actually limited on the Forbidden Limited list for some period of time, because there was a lock with, I believe the card was called DD Borderline, which prevented your opponent from attacking while you didn't have any monsters in your graveyard. So this was limited in the OCG, and now it's unlimited, so you can actually use this card as a trap. Number 5, we have, well, none other than the Ishizu cards themselves, Medora and Keldo. These cards are obviously anti-tiers. You know, in the mirror match, they revolve around shuffling these back, banishing the shuffle back tier names. They can actually be milled by your opponent. Surprise, surprise. If your opponent thinks that you're playing a deck that can be milled that's not tier, they're going to go ahead and use their Kelbeck and Agido effects. So you mill, and boom, you surprise. You hit them with the Medora and Kelda that you happen to mill, which you can use as quick play monster effects in your graveyard to prevent your opponent from fusing. They're also level 4s, so they're really, really nice in decks that can make rank 4s. You know, decks like, especially decks that don't rely on having monsters of specific type. Just having level 4 bodies, like the Pendulum deck. Obviously, level 4s allows them to make synchro or rank 4 plays. And if you happen to draw multiples, again, they are extenders that you can discard off another to summon, just like you would do in the Ishizu Tearlaments deck. So something to keep note of, especially if you're playing a deck that can be milled, or even like Runic Sprite, where you can discard cards for Hugin's effect. You can discard these cards if you happen to draw them. So cool interactions there to keep track of. Number 4, we have Alpha, the Master of Beasts. This monster is a huge monster with 3k attack, can be summoned multiple times a turn. That's not actually once per turn to summon it, but it does have the effect where you can target itself to bounce itself back and then return monsters on the field equal to the amount of Beast, Beast Warrior, or Wing Beast that you return. So if you return itself, you could bounce 1 monster. If you have 2 copies, you can bounce both to bounce 2 monsters on the field. Non-targeting, by the way. So if your opponent has something like Crusadia Avermax, you can actually use this as an out to it, since it does not target, except it targets itself, but it doesn't target the monster that it would bounce. And again, this can be special summoned multiple times a turn. So if your opponent has a huge board, you can summon one and then summon the other one. So you have 2 3k attacks. Into a tier board, it's especially good because it has 3k attacks. So they basically always have to do a 2-for-1 in order to get rid of it. They can obviously out it with a Pearl Rhino pop and an Ishizu, but that again kind of gets rid of 2 cards. They could use Rhino Heart, but again, that they have to trigger a tier name. So if they go ahead and get lucky off like an elf, revive back the Merly, and then somehow hit a name and have Rhino Heart in graveyard, then sure. But again, you kind of like did the job by baiting that out. Also, you can play around that by, if you have Alpha, you could just say leaving main phase to bluff something like an Evenly or like a Super Poly or anything, and they're gonna 9 times out of 10, they'll probably activate Elf to target them early anyways, so they can summon and then they'll fuse into Kick Kalos or something along those lines, and then you can summon your Alpha and then start to wreck their board. Obviously, if they Suliak, it'll negate the effect, but then you can still attack over something with 3k, and 3k is really, really good because it gets over essentially everything except Rhino Heart in the Tearlaments deck, so definitely something to keep track of. You can also make Asa to bait an Ishizu tier, given that it is an Earth monster, so yeah, something cool to keep note of. Number 3, we have Shadow Imprisoning Mirror. This is a card that's seen a lot of play in the past against Shadow strategies, so all dark effects. Negates all the dark effects on the field and the graveyard, so tier effects, but obviously does not stop the Ishizu cards, so it can be easily outed by rank 4 play or Zeus, given that they can summon them from hand, and also the fact that it doesn't actually negate the dark monster effects in hand, so they could summon Havness or something as extenders to build their board and then potentially go into link plays or XYZ plays to get rid of it. But again, if your deck is reliant on the graveyard and you can't play things like Necrovalley or Sojourn, this might be an option for you. Number 2, we have Change of Heart and Mind Control. These cards are actually super insane, as well as Enemy Controller. I should give an honorable mention to. This gets rid of a lot of their big threats. So like if they have a huge monster like a Rukalos on board, you can steal it immediately, which is a pretty big tempo swing given that you take their monster and you get a monster of your own that you can link off or potentially overlay if you happen to play other things like level 8s. And again, if they do only have the tier name on the field as their only tier, it does turn off the face down Suliak if they do happen to have that. Just make sure to be careful not to activate any monster effects as to not trigger the Habness in field, which would allow them to mill as well as turn on the Suliak. But again, this allows you to steal something like a Rukalos, which you can actually use to negate the effect that would summon something. So yeah, super interesting cards that do a lot of work, I would say. And number 1, I think you guys all know this card. Different Dimension Ground. This is a trap card that's basically D-Shifter on a trap form, and it's only for 1 turn, so you can actually play on your following turn if you do happen to use it against your opponent during their turn. It can be chained to something like a Shiren to essentially catch them by surprise, given that they can't really play around it. It's a lot easier to set up because it doesn't require an empty graveyard like D-Shifter would, so you can actually do your full combo and set this card and then flip it on their turn. And yeah, that usually does allow you to skip their turn and potentially kill them on the following turn. So yeah, that's about it from today. I have 10 cards that you guys liked, maybe didn't like. Leave some comments below. Let me know what you think, and subscribe, like, and comment on this channel. I'm going to make some more videos about how to beat tiers as well as how to play them and Yu-Gi-Oh! In general. Deuces.